Hi, welcome to this summary of our class of Wednesday, February the 6th. Try to make this fast if you were there. I'm not sure why you're watching, but I'm glad you're there. If you weren't there, well, I wish you had been. I was particularly good yesterday. I'm just joking. The first thing we did yesterday was look at a quote from American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. She wrote, sometimes just to see the complexity that's there and see it honestly without flinching and without redescribing it in the terms of some excessively simple theory. That is itself progress. What she's getting at there, I'll post this quote. If you didn't quite get all of that, I'll post this quote to Twitter. Um, what she's getting at is this difficulty of seeing the messiness and complexity of any aspect of the world we choose to think about. We often don't appreciate the complexity of um, of the world. We thought yesterday about the complexity just of our class. Think of all of the people, all of the backgrounds, all of the personal histories, the losses and joys that all of us in the class have experienced in our lives, our families' backgrounds, our families' histories, the complexities of our individual personal lives, our dreams, our ambitions. Just imagine the complexity, the rich complexity of the humans that are represented in our class. It's so easy just to walk by a classroom, a simple classroom like you walk by every day, and look at it and say, "Oh, it's just a bunch of people. It's just a bunch of kids in there, in a college class." Enough said. There it is. But if you begin to think a little bit more carefully, you begin to appreciate the enormous complexity represented there. Now, we come to a difficult question like the Palestinian Israeli conflict. The complexity there is just enormous. The complexities of religion, of geography, location, the history of anti-Semitism, the representation of Arabs in Hebrew literature, the representation of Arabs in Western literature, the whole process from the United Nations and the history of Zionism. This is just an incredibly complex amalgam of stuff that's almost sort of mind-blowing to think about trying to master just in order to figure out why these people are having such a tough time of it. Nussbaum is saying it's so easy to look at the world and say, not that complex. We don't need to, we want to describe the world in her words, in some excessively simple way. It's our reflex to try to simplify the world so we can get through it more easily, so we can navigate it, negotiate it, move through our days more easily. Else we get stuck, we get mired in the complexity of even the most simple things that we try to do. But for those non-trivial things that we do try to do, like understand complex conflicts like the one in the Middle East, it is worth it to look at the detail, to try to describe it in terms of what's really there, not in terms of a bias that we might have, not in terms of some excessively simple theory such as, oh, well, that's just Zionism, and Zionism is just racism, and it's really not much more complicated than that. We need to get rid of Zionism. da-dum, and let it go at that. That's really not a healthy intellectually approach that's intellectual, has intellectual integrity to it. So our challenge is, in Nussbaum's words, to see the complexity and appreciate the complexity of whatever part of the world, whatever little piece of the world we're looking at, and take the time to see it honestly and not reduce it, because it might be easier for us not to reduce it to something simple just because it makes our cognitive life a little bit easier. It is hard to be intellectually honest in the face of a very complex reality. Okay? So then we moved on to the question of our Monday project. Monday, what is Monday? I think it's today's the 7th, the 11th, February the 11th. We're going to do an in-class writing project. And it's going to, the prompt, I posted the prompt to Blackboard. It's in course documents, as well as, I believe I posted it also to assignments. The prompt deals with this problem that we dealt with on Monday, on the 4th, about the Jewish writer's moral responsibility to stand with the oppressed. Susan Sontag, an American writer who we thought about on Monday, contended that she felt it was her responsibility as a Jewish writer. Jews have historically been persecuted through the centuries. Because Jews have had this experience, this historical experience of persecution, it behooves a Jewish writer to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, with the powerless, with the weak. In the situation with the Palestinians and the Israelis, as we have seen already, it is the Palestinians who are the oppressed party here, who are the weaker of the two parties. Now, so there's this question of the moral responsibility of the Jewish writer to stand in solidarity with the oppressed. We're thinking about that question in order to think about a larger question, and that is whether or not Khirbet Khizeh, that we've been reading, is an anti-Semitic work or can be understood as an anti-Semitic work, since it can be understood as a criticism of the Israeli military at the time that the State of Israel came into existence. Yes, S. Yejar is capturing his experiences of that day in 1948 when his unit was charged with emptying out this one particular village. Khirbet Khizeh is a made-up village, but his story is based on his actual experiences of his unit doing this to a real historical village. What we have, though, is this question of whether it is anti-Semitic to criticize a young state whose whole reason for being is to protect this historically oppressed minority, Jews. Is that anti-Semitic? Was the early Israel, the Israel just as it had been created by the United Nations, 1948, was it wrong to capture what the military did that day, how it treated those Palestinian villagers? Did that represent, by doing that, did that represent a threat to the state of Israel? Or taking it one step further, did that actually question the legitimacy of the state of Israel? Very tough questions. So we have to think about the definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews, the attribution to Jews of all kinds of horrible things, control of the monetary system, control of the world, all sorts of nasty, awful, vile conspiracy theories. This is anti-Semitism. But there are more subtle kinds of anti-Semitism. And the question that I want you to write about on Monday is whether what Yizhar wrote in this book could be construed as anti-Semitic, because it did criticize the Israeli military at this very vulnerable moment in the history of the very young Israel. Now, the last thought that I want you to keep in mind as you look at the actual prompt and write this on Monday is this irony. Yizhar is a Jew who wrote a work that we can argue came down on the side of the Palestinians. If you accept Susan Sontag's claim that it is the responsibility of a Jewish writer, precisely because the writer is Jewish, if you accept that claim, then does it not follow that Yizhar had no choice but to write a work that was actually coming down on the side of the Palestinians, and he was doing this precisely because he was a Jew. He was having to, he was morally obligated to show the vulnerability of the Palestinians that day in 1948, the arguably cruel ways that these villagers were forced from their village. And he was obligated to show this because of his Jewishness as a writer. So I'm going to ask you to argue, whether you think Khirbet Khizeh is anti-Semitic or not. If so, why? If not, why not? So look at the prompt on Blackboard. I would print it if I were you. I would print it and bring it to class on Monday. I'll also project it onto the screen at the front of the classroom, so if you forget it, or if you'd rather look at that than worry with a piece of paper, that's fine. But let all of this percolate around in your head. Think about the nature of the state. Is the state somehow, under any circumstances, immune from criticism? Is it somehow ever immoral to criticize the state? Was Yizhar criticizing the state of Israel in the book, or was he criticizing the government of Israel? Or was he just criticizing the military of Israel and the tactics that were used? If he's criticizing the government, is that okay in the case of a Jewish state? Or is it anti-Semitic? Very important question. Okay? Another thing that I talked about in the time we spent together was when you're reading a text, be sure you stop and look, up the words that you don't know. Some of the words that I came to in my reading as I reread the novella the other day that I wondered if you had paused to look up were miasma, turbid, fetid, pellucid, aridity, fastidious. Do you know these words? When you ran into these words in your reading, did you stop and look them up if you didn't know them? Make it a habit of doing that, because I will ask you about words that I suspect may be new to you in our readings. So keep your phone browser open to dictionary.com or whatever you like to use and look up words that you don't know. We also talked about the process of close reading and annotation in more detail than we did in the past. And I posted to Blackboard a document from the Harvard Writing Center called How to Do a Close Reading. I will not go over that here in any detail, but do look at that document, How to Do a Close Reading. Annotating, doing a close reading, what that means, taking time with the text and looking carefully at how a writer goes about telling his or her story. Not just what's in the story, but how the writer tells it. Notice these things about a text: metaphor, plot, characterization, figures of speech, imagery, rhetorical devices. Look at these things. Even if you don't know precisely what a technical name for something is, if it jumps off the page and seems significant to you, mark it. Now, why? Two reasons. One is you're going to get to know the text so much better if you approach it this way. And the second reason is when you go back to write about the text, right? You're going to find it so much easier to find textual examples to strengthen your argument. Okay? So, good reasons for doing close reading and annotating. Yes, it will take you more time than if you simply run your eyes over the lines of text, close the book, and go on with your life. But you will not really have read, and in the long run, that will cost you. Okay, and then we returned to actually looking at the text of Khirbet Khizeh and finished out our time together. So I hope this is of some help to you. Always like to hear your feedback. That's all for today. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.